Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We welcome you to this Provost Distinguished Faculty Lecture Series. And on behalf of Provost Brown, who can't be here tonight, I want to welcome you to this lecture. My name is Nathan Lindsay, and I serve as the Associate Provost for Dynamic Learning. And this lecture series showcases UM faculty members who have received national or international awards for their research and creative scholarship over the past year. Tonight's lecture features Professor Benedicte Boisseron of the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures. And Dr. Boisseron received the Nicholas Gillian Outstanding Book Award from the Caribbean Philosophical Association this past spring for her book, which was called Creole Renegades, Rhetoric of Betrayal and Guilt in the Caribbean Diaspora. Sounds like a great book. And congratulations on that award. I now invite Dean Chris Comer, Dean of the College of Humanities and Sciences, to introduce Professor Boisseron's lecture. Thank you.
So good evening. This is one of the most enjoyable parts of the job of being a dean. You get to introduce some of your fine faculty for an hour of engaging with their work, and it's just about the best thing we do. You heard the basis for the invitation tonight for Benedicte to speak. She's produced award-winning books. She's co-authored a textbook. She's published many articles in distinguished journals. She has served as section head of French in the Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures department. She's really kind of a rising star academically, both on the campus and nationally. What I wanted to tell you is that I just had the pleasure of reviewing a proposal she wrote, and the proposal had to do with her synthesizing her area of interest in Caribbean and Black culture and merging it with a new interest she has, which is relationship between people and animals. And I got very excited when I read this. I thought, this is fabulous stuff. And this is the first time I'm going to get to hear her speak about it, so I'm really excited about that. But more than that, I want to put in a little plug for the fact that this coming spring, we have this wonderful event on campus called the Community Lecture Series, and we choose a topic of importance, and we make sure that it's available to the community. It's usually very well attended. It takes place in February and March, and the theme for this spring is the humanities. And we will have a chance to showcase the humanities on the campus in a really important way. I'm very excited to see Ashby here. He's helped us organize this, and Professor Boisseron will be, in fact, speaking at that, so you'll get to hear a little bit more about her work then. So without further ado, I want to give you the pleasure to hear from her. She'll speak for probably 40 minutes or so, and they'll have plenty of time for questions. And her title tonight is Afro-Dog, the Animal Question in the Black Diaspora. Benedicte.
Good evening. So the Department of Justice 2015 investigation of the Ferguson Police Department uncovered a connection between race and the repressive use of police dogs in the city of Ferguson, Missouri. As the report stated, and you have the quote right here, in every canine bite incident for which racial information is available, the subject was African American. While police dogs were also used during the protests in 2014 that followed the death of African American teen Michael Brown in Ferguson, their absence during the Baltimore riots in 2015 was noted by politician Highland Buddy Fowler Jr., who suggested via social media that attack dogs should be launched against those who took to the streets after the death of Freddie Gray. What I would like to suggest this evening is that the post-Ferguson era has brought back to consciousness a tradition which is long-standing in America to associate dogs and blacks in tales of violence. This is a story about mobility and mobilizing. Since the slave trade in the history of not only America, but also the Americas, but also the Black Atlantic, which includes France, mobilizing, but also the mobility of blacks, have presented a threat that has often been associated with the idea of the animal. Here we're talking about the animal like the dog, but also the animal that one eats, fast food, as the politician just said. First, let's talk about the situation in a French context. In 2014, la Fondation 30 Millions d'Amis, in English, the 30 Million Friends Foundation, which is the largest animal rights organization in France, won an important battle. They had been collecting signatures to pressure the French government to revisit the status of the animal in the French Civil Code. The French Civil Code, dating back to Napoleon, considers the animal to be meuble. A French word, meuble, means in French, furniture. That's what people think, right? You remember that, right? Good job. The goal of the organization was to pressure the government to get rid of the identification of the animal with a simple chair, while also acknowledging animal sentience. The French National Assembly passed the amendment back in April 2014, agreeing to delete the meuble mention and to add a phrase about animal sensibility. The Animal Law, Ethics and Science Organization, which is a French organization, didn't agree with 30 Million Friends. The scientific organization argued that the campaign of 30 Million Friends was based on a flawed perception of the law. Here's the reason. Indeed, in everyday language, when used as a noun, meuble means furniture. But if the word is used as an adjective, which is the case in the judicial language, the word refers not to a piece of furniture, but rather to the mobility of a given property. In other words, the use of the word meuble in the Civil Code is meant to designate a personal property that can be moved, as opposed to immeuble, which is a property that is fixed to the ground, like a pigeon coop or a beehive. Meuble, therefore, means that the animal's mobility relies on the owner, since it does not belong to the premises. In 2015, the French Senate rejected the amendment, but the National Assembly had the last word and once again voted to suppress the word meuble in the French Civil Code. Why and how should this story be relevant to the Black diaspora? First, because the Code Noir, the French Black Code of 1685, that regulated the treatment of slaves in the French Caribbean islands, had also defined the slave as meuble. Chapter 44 of the French Black Code is now famous, or rather infamous, for stating that l'esclave est meuble. You will hear people and even scholars state that l'esclave est un meuble in the Black Code, rather than technically speaking saying like l'esclave est meuble. So l'esclave est un meuble, un meaning a piece of furniture, whereas meuble just means movable. That's the difference between the two. As we see, the same confusion applies to the Civil Code as to the Slave Code. Both seem to ignore the question of mobility and the control that comes with it. That being said, the difference between animal and slave law today is that the animal is no longer meuble, because it's just been suppressed in 2015, but the slave will remain forever a movable property, since the meuble designation was never deleted in the now obsolete document. What is interesting in the confusion over the term meuble is that the discussion has revolved around the question of the animal as a chair. And as we all know, the animal is not a chair, when the real issues should have been the relation between mobility and agency. The message of the Black Code, the French Black Code and the Civil Code, is that both the slave and the animal are meant to lack agency in their mobility. Being movable means that the one who does the moving is not the same as the one who is moving. The leash, the tag on the collar, and the fenced backyard remind us that the dog has the capacity, yet not the freedom to move as it wishes. Whether animal or human, the unwanted, uncontrolled movement of the other is a source of unfathomable fears. Look at Hitchcock's Birds, or the exponential growth of the rat population in the horror movie Willard. Same with domesticated animals. There is a common fear of a pack of stray dogs, which in one's imagination is always potentially infected with rabies and ready to attack. This is the reason why meuble is a symbolically charged word. It points to the responsibility of the owner not to leave his or her living, hence moving, property unattended. Since Napoleon, however, the streets of France have cleared off, rabies has been eradicated, and dogs are under human control. Now we need to turn to the other living subject, once defined as meuble. How to control and contain the French black, formerly known as meuble. Martinique and Guadeloupe are two ex-French colonies that became French departments in 1946. France hosted its slave trade in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and also Saint-Domingue, which is now known as Haiti. Haiti chose a different route for Martinique and Guadeloupe. After the famous Haitian Revolution, the island became the first independent black republic in the world. The famous revolutionary writer, Frantz Fanon, who was born in 1925 in Martinique and grew up there, understood that his fellow countrymen from Martinique and also Guadeloupe would never be a threat to French supremacy, the way that Haiti had once been during the Haitian Revolution. This is why Fanon joined the Algerian revolutionary cause in the mid-1950s and published The Wretched of the Earth in defense of violence against the French oppressor. Fanon, born under the name France, which reminds you of the country France, died as Ibrahim Fanon and is buried in Algeria. So he rejected his French nationality and Martinican nationality because he felt like Guadeloupe had no guts and they would not fight against France the way that Haiti did. The Algerians chose the revolution when Martinique and Guadeloupe had opted for the more peaceful departmentalization. So they became, departments mean state. It's like an American state. So they are French departments. They belong to France. Martinique and Guadeloupe stayed right where they were, in the hands of the French. Nevertheless, better safe than sorry. Even though Martinicans and Guadeloupeans do not seem to carry the revolutionary gene, France implemented a policy that has made it easy to control their movements. 4 years after Martinique and Guadeloupe became French departments, France passed a law called congé bonifié. Through this law, civil servants, originally from the islands, the French islands, but working and living in France, could vacation in their island every 3 years at the expense of the French government. It's still the case today. The congé bonifié law is still today an important part of the Negropolitan culture. The word Negropolitan refers to the population of blacks from the Caribbean living in France. With this law, Martinicans and Guadeloupeans can keep ties with their families and culture, while conveniently enough, the French government can keep tabs on the commute of their French nationals of slave and colonized descent, because they know that every 3 years they will go back to the native land and then they will come back, so they know exactly where they are. From the transatlantic side, the ebb and flow of French blacks is under control. It is a different story in America. To understand the full extent of the relation between meuble, mobility, and agency in America, we need to go back to the slavery era. There, dogs and slaves share a history. Dogs were imported to the Americas to chase runaway slaves. In this chase, one species started taking after the other, taking after in the French philosopher Jacques Derrida's sense of resembling each other. In his fictional book, Le vieil homme esclave et le molosse, which in English has been translated as The Old Man Slave and the Mastiff, the Martinican novelist Patrick Chamoiseau gave a poetic rendition of the chase, showing clearly how one takes after the other, The dog was used as a mean dog whose role was to run after the bad slave. The dog and the slave are both perceived as bad in this unrestrained chase. The slave and the dog taking off is perceived as threatening and dangerous, owing to the fact that both subjects are meant to be movable rather than moving, and they are moving when they're in the chase. That being said, the dog and the black's perceived badness has been treated differently in the legal system, a difference that has massive repercussions. In her book, The Law is a White Dog, Colleen Diane explains that for centuries, American and British law has been struggling to determine the status of the dog because the dog is said to be a hybrid kind, trainable but still always potentially vicious. We've all heard of dogs snapping and turning against their owners. Dogs are in that sense different from a cattle animal that is fully submissive. The dog's imperfect trainability is what makes this animal not fully ownable in the eyes of the law. On the other hand, in the French Black Code, but also in the various southern Black Codes in America, the slave is said to be fully ownable. Of course, disavowing the imperfect property status of the slave is the only way to make slave-based economy sustainable. Like a symptom, however, this disavowal was bound to resurface in what we may call the Cujo or Cujo effect. We'll start with Cujo. Cujo, the title of a horror movie from the 1980s, is the story of a Saint Bernard named Cujo who contracted rabies after being bitten by a vampire bat. The dog, who has completely lost it, eats his owner alive and turns against everybody in a bloodbath. Has anyone seen the movie? Yeah, Cujo? Yeah, cult movie. But Cujo is also the name of one of the most celebrated Maroon leaders in the history of Jamaica. Maroon means runaway slave who just organized in a group to try to rebel against the plantation owners. Cujo was a fearless rebel, boasting numerous victories against the British. Cujo's attacks against the British were known to be dreadful and very bloody. The Cujo amalgam hints at a retaliative and ferocious propensity in the slave and the dog alike. The slave is motivated by a claim to humanness, and the dog by wolfish instinct. By ignoring the imperfect property status of the slave, the law has disavowed what could have been seen as a justified inclination in the slave to go ballistic on the master. The master acknowledged this inclination in the dog, but not in the slave. By ignoring it, it has only made it more present in our collective mind. This is why, as I want to argue tonight, there is an obsession in the slavery-impacted culture of America to bring the black and the dog together when it comes to images of violence and rebellion. Let's think of the civil rights riots of 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. Police dogs were used against black protesters exactly like during slavery. What brings the dog, the slave, and the civil rights protester together under the same ferocious stigma is their common claim for freedom of movement, a claim that has been ultimately perceived as a feral claim, a wild claim. As Paul Youngquist puts it so eloquently in an article, dogs are biological weapons deployed against an enemy whose animal ferocity justify a response in kind. So in that kind of situation, you see that both the one who riots, the black who riots, and the dog are both ferocious. In other words, blacks claiming freedom of movement are meant to be perceived as and treated like wild animals. Diane's tour de force in her book, The Law is a White Dog, is to have put side by side two legal cases that bring out a striking resonance between dog and black law. Both laws are related to the question of restricted freedom of movement in America. The well-known racial case, Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, and the dog case, Sentinel versus New Orleans and Carlton Railroad Company of 1897, reached the Supreme Court 1 year apart, only 1 year apart. And in both instances, Justice Henry Brown was left with the task of determining what kind of restrictions of movement should be imposed on the black and the dog. In Santel versus New Orleans, Santel was seeking compensation for the loss of property after an electric car negligently killed his dog. When the case reached the Supreme Court, Justice Brown ruled against Santel, stating that in Louisiana, there is only conditional property of dogs, meaning that the dog must be registered and wear a collar in order to be legally considered personal property. And Santel's dog was not registered. But more importantly, Justice Brown argues that property, this is a quote from the court decision, property in dogs is of an imperfect and qualified nature, that as they stand, as it were, between feral animals in which, until killed or subdued, there is no property, and domestic animals in which the right of property is perfect and complete. So the dog is neither nor, just in between. Justice Brown also posits that because of their rabies predisposition, dogs are unreliable and must be restrained. For Justice Brown, there is no place for a dog on the loose, since the dog is by nature a loose cannon. Same with Plessy versus Ferguson. Justice Brown's decision to withhold the constitutionality of racial segregation in public facilities under the separate but equal doctrine also guaranteed that no blacks be free to roam. Justice Brown seems to fear the free movement of what should have remained restrained. The 2012 Quentin Tarantino movie, Django Unchained, can be seen as the enactment of Justice Brown's fear, though adjusted to the slavery era and not the civil rights era. The movie shows the extreme goriness resulting from a black unchained and on the loose. After canine hydrophobia, namely the Cujo effect, comes the black freedom of movement, that is the Cujo effect. It's a nigger on a horse. An astounded man tells a woman as Django enters the city on a horse alongside the German bounty hunter. The town freezes at the sight of a black man with full mobility and velocity. They ain't never seen no black man on a horse, Django says. The movie includes a dog scene in which a runaway slave is torn into pieces while Django is forced to watch. The scene is only a prelude to Django's fate. At the end of the movie, Django is hung upside down and he barely escapes getting his genitals cut off with a knife. Knives and dog fangs equally target the flesh as a punitive and preventive method against the black's will to violate his or her restriction of movement. As punishment, it was not uncommon in the American South and the Caribbean to mutilate runaway slaves upon their capture. The Code Noir and Jamaican Black Code recommended cutting body parts, ears, hocks, sometimes a foot or a hand, to deter slaves from further escape attempts. Mutilation and ravenous dogs remind the slave that she or he is, unlike the dog, a cattle. But more importantly, like a farmed animal, the slave is defined not only by his or her chattel status, but also by his or her edible condition. When the black runs away, the master needs to symbolically reassert his domination through a ritualized act of meat-like flesh cutting. Here I need to go back again to Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, who argued that men are predominantly carnivorous in order to assert their masculine domination. This is what Derrida names carnophallogocentrism. Big word that I wrote here. Through the dog or the knife, the master enacts the symbolic act of eating the slave. This is where the joke from the politician takes its full meaning. Blacks mobilizing or running away are indeed fast food. In Le Jeu le plus dangereux, Grégoire Chamaillou recounts the little-known cannibalistic event that occurred in 1802 during the Saint-Domingue, so the Haitian slave rebellion. Hundreds of bloodhounds from Cuba were sent to Saint-Domingue in view of crushing the slave rebellion. General Louis de Noailles, who worked under Rochambeau, which was the general of Napoleon, and who was on a mission to defeat Toussaint Louverture's army. Toussaint Louverture was the leader of the slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue in Haiti. Rochambeau informed the general that no budget had been allocated to feed the 28 dogs sent to Saint-Domingue. You must give them Negroes for food, Rochambeau told him. As fate would have it, the French soldiers lost ground against the resilient Maroons, the rebellious slaves, and as a result, the French army lost access to their food supply. The French soldiers were forced to eat the dogs that had been previously fed with the flesh of the slaves. This historical incident brings the fantasy of the edible black to its fullest expression. Because black edibility is a fantasy that has been sublimated through the proxy use of dogs in lieu of cannibalistic humans, dogs tearing black flesh apart have become a haunting and unresolved image in the collective memory of slavery and the civil rights movement. As a result, dog fangs digging into black flesh is a recurrent image that first appeared in testimonials from Bartolomé de las Casas to Frederick Douglass and then became deeply ingrained in popular culture. Historians have no doubt that dogs chasing and tearing into pieces Native Americans, also Native Americans and slaves, is a true part of the history of the Americas, but the extent of this practice is not really known. What we know is that this practice has attracted much attention in popular culture. It starts with Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Stowe's novel holds a famous passage of a runaway slave called Eliza crossing the frozen Ohio River with her baby in her arms while being chased by a slave merchant and 2 slaves. By 1880, to attract people, all stage productions of Uncle Tom's Cabin included a pack of ferocious-looking dogs, and usually before the production, the pack of dogs were in the streets to attack the audience, so they were just barking to attract people and to already create a sensational fear. The recurrence of the canine probe gave people the impression that Stowe's book was filled with dogs chasing slaves, when in reality the Eliza scene is the only incident in the book involving the idea of chasing dogs. And it's just mentioned. It doesn't even happen in the book. The merchant said, maybe we should use dogs. And then someone else says, no, because she's beautiful and we might lose something, so let's not use dogs. That's the only mention in the scene. There have been questions as to the inflated nature of stories of dogs devouring slaves, but the question remains as to the motivation behind and the effect of those potential inflations. The image of the vicious dog following after the slave has become part of a collective consciousness that compulsively recreates and each time reignites the association of the vicious dog with the black. The best example of it, since Uncle Tom's Cabin, is Andy Warhol's 1964 Race Riots series. In 1963, the photographer Charles Moore took pictures of the corner German Shepherd police dogs that we saw previously the picture of, attacking black rioters in Birmingham, Alabama. Moore sold the photographs to Life magazine, which released the pictures in May 1963. In the summer of the same year, for a 1964 exhibit in Paris at the Galerie Ilénea Sonnabend, Andy Warhol made paintings of Moore's dog pictures, like his rendition of Marilyn Monroe's portrait or the Campbell Soup cans. Warhol's paintings faithfully reproduced the original photograph, but with a significant added difference in colors, tones, and hues. The same year, Warhol made another series for a museum in Hartford, Connecticut. The interesting fact about, as Warhol has called them, the Race Riot series, is like the many renditions of, exactly like the many renditions of Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. The vicious dog attacking the black person is the only image that Warhol chose to single out and iconize in Moore's otherwise varied photo essay. Likewise, in 1991, artist James Drake made a sculpture out of the Birmingham dogs. The sculpture is standing in Ingram Park, Birmingham. When crossing the hallway, visitors are made to relive the African-American experience of Connor's dog attacks. In the sculpture, the white and black men are nowhere to be found. Drake's sculpture brings the image to a point. The dogs are the last ones standing in a narrative of racial tension between black and white men. Dogs attacking blacks haunts American collective consciousness as it reveals a compulsion to represent, in the sense of making present again, this particular image of racially invested aggression. Warhol's repetition of the same picture empties the subject of its content and gives it an allegorical surface similar to Marilyn Diptych or Campbell's soup can. One no longer needs to see the black man next to the dog's fangs or the white man holding the leash in order to know that the attack dog, the mean dog, means not only racism but also race. What is interesting in the black, white, and dog situation, however, is that what often attracts attention today is not the white man, but the black man as the owner of an attack dog, like a pit bull. Think of Michael Vick, the famous black quarterback convicted of his participation and financing of dogfighting with pit bulls. This case focused in the media on the racial dimension of a black man with pit bulls, often a threatening image. I don't have time to detail how the media represented the importance of race and the black man and the dog here. Jean-Claude Baker, in his biography of Josephine Baker, finds a correlation between black freedom of movement and the ownership of fierce dogs. Talking about his adoptive mother, Josephine Baker, in the Paris of the mid-1920s, the author writes, I quote, "For a long time, I couldn't figure out why every black entertainer who came to Europe brought dogs, fierce dogs, like wolves. Josephine had one so savage, she had to board it in a kennel. Finally, a friend put it all together. During slavery, blacks were haunted with dogs. In Europe, they could take a kind of revenge. They could own the same kind of dogs that chased their ancestors. So there they were in the little hotel rooms, and they had those huge dogs," end quote. There is no doubt that black emancipation could have resulted in a rise of any type of black ownership, including dog ownership. In the 19th and 20th centuries, dog fighting was mainly a practice from the white rural South. But in the 1980s, there was an influx of urban blacks into breeding circles. The 1980s saw the first black emancipated generation after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and potentially the first generation of blacks able to roam freely and, coincidentally enough, in the company of dogs. That being said, unlike what Jean-Claude Baker suggests, the association of blacks and attack dogs in American collective consciousness is not based on an actual revenge of the black race, but rather on the white fantasy of black revenge. Blacks do not own fierce dogs as retribution for slavery, but those who do own dogs are unconsciously perceived as revengeful due to the lingering fantasy of the Cujo effect. Blacks owning big dogs enacts Justice Brown's double fear, the black and the dog together on the loose, without the white master. In 2005, the city of Denver passed a pit bull ordinance that initiated a mass killing of dogs out of pure and at times irrational fear of pit bulls. We may suggest here a symbolic connection between the 2005 pit bull ordinance and black men losing their lives in the hands of fearful policemen or vigilante who tend to perceive black jaywalking or roaming the streets as a threatening presence. I think of Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, or Eric Gardner. In his 1970 novel Chien Blanc, White Dog in English, the French writer Romain Gary visualizes what happens when the white southerner loses hold of both his dog and the black. In the fictional memoir-like story, Gary imagines finding a lost so-called white dog. The white dog was the dog in the South trained to attack the black. They were called white dogs. Gary names the dog Bacta. Eventually in the story, Bacta is taken over by a character who looks like Malcolm X and who secretly trains the dog to attack white people back. The story ends with Gary being viciously bitten by what used to be a white dog, became a black dog. Like Bacta, the white dog is perceived today as no longer white. The dog has been bitten by the black, and both share a Cujo kinship against which the old master seeks protection. The Cujo effect is mainly a fantasy projected on the defeated. It is the idea that the so-called other might fight back with extreme violence when one least expects it. The Cujo effect is also related to the question of move, as opposed to movability, the fear of the defeated making his or her move. The Cujo effect has made the streets of America unsafe for blacks and the police alike, as both wait to see who will move first. Thank you. I was told that if there are any questions, we have to...
If you want to use the mic.
Yes, Eric.
Not particularly, should I?
Because of her.
It's not a substantive question, more context. What of all the interesting intertexts and works of art you've foregrounded here, and I'll refer to Cujo as an intertext and not a work of art. I'm really fascinated by the Drake sculpture, and I was just curious. It seemed as if you were saying we read that, or an audience would read that as implying race and racial tension. Could you just say a little bit about the background of that particular sculpture and how and why it was commissioned, and maybe something about the artist?
I don't know why it was commissioned. All I know is that it was in honor in 1991 of the Birmingham riots, and there is not much known about it. I just discovered that sculpture through a professor who took people to the south and students to the south, and they visited that. It was one of the sites to visit, actually, but I don't know much more about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great. I'll look that one.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Benedicte, for the great, intriguing talk. I attended graduate school in St. Louis back in the day, and I, in fact, taught a summer course at a community college next to Ferguson. So I'm fairly familiar with the St. Louis community and issues there. And I was really struck by the way in which you highlighted the notion of mobility and immobility, and in many languages, in fact, that notion of the immobile is related to real estate and the idea of non-separation from the idea of the ground and the base and whatnot. And as you were sharing that, I was reminded of a really intriguing series that was featured in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch back in the mid-90s about two Baptist churches which were located on the same corner in the neighborhood in which I lived. One was a white Baptist church, the other was a black Baptist church. In the 80 years at that point that the two churches had stood basically around the corner from one another, there had never been a mutual social function between the two churches. And I guess, with regard to this idea of, mobility, stability, fluidity, concreteness, I'm wondering if there's also a kind of flip side whereby this notion of the stable, of the non-mobile, which I started to associate with that anecdote of these two churches that are indeed part of that immobility, that on the one hand certainly is an articulation of the systems in society, notions and associations that are quite fixed, that on the reverse side, the very dynamic of fluidity and change is something that can be represented in this domain of the other, and that we also saw take place in Ferguson, where in fact it is a voice that does become amplified and ultimately can be seen as making a difference in terms of reassessing this idea of the stable and the fixed. I guess what you're pointing to is the fact that on the one hand there is this sort of hierarchy of power whereby the fixed and the stable is able to dictate. But I'm wondering, if you could comment further on, the the potential agency of, the runaway, as it were, in terms of, facing and questioning and ultimately dissolving those kinds of associations that otherwise lead to this ongoing, separate but equal kind of reality that we also see taking place in Europe, very importantly. I mean, one thinks of the current refugee situation and the idea of the fixed, the national versus the transient, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, in kind of basic terms, what do you make of, this possibility, too, of the separate and the equal in a certain way, whereby that other can be seen as a kind of equal to counter the notion of the fixed or the stable?
So, if I understand well, you're asking how subversive mobility and powerful mobility and mobilizing can be?
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, of course, but that's the point of mobilizing. I think it can be very powerful, like you can see the Black Lives Matter movement. That has mobilized. But what I find interesting, I will use two examples. What I find interesting with the Black Lives Matter movement is recently again, Sarah Palin, I don't know if you've heard, she said, she mentioned the rioters in the Black Lives Matter movement as dogs, and she asked Obama to call back the dogs. It's a coincidence, but I found it an interesting coincidence that it's always the idea that black mobilization is on the loose, and you have to call back the dogs to be on the leash. And I think that every movement that is seen from the other perspective, that is made by the other, will always be an expression of threat and rebellion, not just about voicing your claims of freedom. It's just always rebellious. And I'm thinking of another situation in France, not with the black population, but with the Algerian population. There's been an influx of Algerian immigration after World War II, and now the Algerians in France are seen as the main threat for the French population. And they often reside, if I take Paris as an example, they often reside in the suburbs, which is called the banlieue, which is a very negative term as well for the sorts of projects that surround Paris. And what surrounds Paris in medieval times was called the zone, which was a space that was not supposed to be inhabited because Paris wanted to have peripheral view of the others coming from the outside. So you were not supposed to reside in the zone, but many people illegally reside in the zone. And today that zone is the banlieue. And how do we often call the Algerians in French? We call them the zonards, which is a very negative term to say that it's people who are vulgar, but also zonard comes from zoner, the verb zoner, which means people who roam endlessly and who don't have a specific purpose. So again, you have the idea of immigration, the other, and movement as something negative. That's pretty typical.
Can I add just a brief note to that? Ferguson is importantly a suburb. And so, the tensions that are involved there have to do with African-American upward social mobility. It's just been in the last decade or two that it's become a majority black environment. So, that too is part of that challenge of going from the separate and equal fixed, status of things to a society in flux. And it's very much on account of that dynamic taking place where, historically it was the inner city that was associated with African-American culture. Now it's in the suburbs, and we see then the sort of white reaction to that, which is a great parallel to what you're talking about with Paris.
That was fantastic. I think you really tapped a very deep vein here. And so I have a comment and a question. And actually, a third thing, a plea, because I want to hear more about Michael Vick and your take on that. But the comment is, I grew up in Texas, and I think you've tapped into something really powerful in terms of seeing this as a second-order phenomenon. This is a projection of white fantasies of power. And this is a comment, an anecdotal comment. Where I grew up in Texas, it's very, very common for white dog owners to say, and I tear up when I say this because it's really just, they would say, my dog's really kind. He's not mad at anyone, but he hates black people. Very common. And so they will actually apologize for the behavior of their dog, which they've clearly trained to be nervous around black people. So it's very deep in the culture in the South, very deep on the white side of that equation that you're talking about. And that's why I'm very curious to hear you say more about Michael Vick and that dog culture. You know, we lived actually in Newport News where he grew up, and there's a lot of dog breeding in that area, and it's very tightly associated with people's identities. They're hounds if they're hunters, and they're pit bulls if they're fighters. And that actually is my question. I want you to comment on the Michael Vick because I want to hear what you have to say, but also that sculpture, you know, the German Shepherd is such an iconic police dog, but that sculpture, those aren't German Shepherds. I don't know if you can go back to it, but those are hounds. And I find that a very interesting way of memorializing that particular riot to switch the breed. And so that, I want to know more, like Eric does, about the sculptor himself. But I mean, those are quite clearly hounds and not German Shepherds.
Which goes back to slavery, which
Yeah.
were hounds and not German Shepherds.
Yeah. So I think that's the comment, but I'd love to hear you talk more about Michael Vick.
Michael Vick, there is a scholar in San Diego, and I forgot her name right now, who wrote an article on Michael Vick. And she explained that when the story came out, they were, of course, supporters of Michael Vick, and also it was a racially invested support as well for some of them. And she mentions a show on the NPR when people called and said, no, it has nothing to do with race. It could be blue, black, purple. I would still feel the same about what happened. And as the scholar explained, yes, but he's not blue, purple, or orange. He's black. And so because of that, race has an impact on how you talk about the situation. And it would be discussed differently if Michael Vick was white. And so in that, she also showed that the media often anthropomorphized dogs and animalized Michael Vick, talking about him being neutered and all those expressions. And unfortunately, it's not the same to do it when you have such a history of violence between blacks and dogs in America. He's not purple. So that answers it anyway, yeah.
Thank you so much. I just had a question about, I was wondering, you were talking about the marrons, the runaway slaves, and were there runaway dogs, and did the two ever meet up and fight against, I was just curious if the runaway slaves ever managed to use dogs against, and they're fighting against the owners. And then I had another question while I'm up here. In the South, after the Civil War, were there laws about blacks being able or not being able to own dogs? Is there anything, does that come up at all in your research?
I haven't come across it, but it's a very good question. I have to look at it. And for your first question, there are no historical facts about runaway dogs joining the maroon community, but there is a fictional account of it. When the one that I mentioned about Patrick Chamoiseau from Martinique, he imagined an old black slave running it was always running in the forest, in the wild, and the master launching that dog after the slave, and both got lost, and both became one, and both were unleashed from the master. So he tried to imagine that, of course, owning the dog for the slave. But it's not historical, it's just fictional.
Given the time, maybe I could wrap this up with one final question from the floor, but we can stay and continue discussion, so I don't want to end things formally. And this is a bit of a plant, but could you talk a little bit about going forward in time, this horrible association, unfortunately, between black population and dogs? How do we break that negative stereotype, and what are ways we can, shine a light on a more reasonable relationship here?
That's a difficult question. The only way is it's just a question of representation in the media or in books, trying to represent dogs with relationships between dogs and blacks in a more positive light, as we've discussed about the project I'm trying to do on the side, and Chris has been helping me with this. In Detroit, I'll make it brief, but in Detroit there is you know that Detroit filed for bankruptcy a few years ago, and a third of the population left Detroit because of this economical and social situation. And many people left their dogs behind. So there is a kind of insignificant population of stray dogs in Detroit. The story became sensationalized in 2013 with a Rolling Stone magazine and Bloomberg writing 2 articles about the fact that there were 50,000 stray dogs roaming the streets in Detroit, and that became a very dangerous city with those packs of ferocious dogs. The number was inflated very much for sensational reasons, but it was also a way to show that Detroit, that is totally on the loose, with many vacant lands and vacant homes, where actually only blacks and stray dogs are there to fend for themselves. Those kinds of pictures that you would see in the Rolling Stone magazine, but also in a TV show that came out 2 years ago about taking place in Detroit, where you see those stray dogs and violence and everything associated with black. That's the kind of images that needs to be changed in the media, in literature, in every iconic media outlets. Thank you.
So much. Thank you for the great questions. As Dean Comer said, please stay around for more questions. And let's give Benedicte one more